We'll keep Mickey Hart in the background there. Naked Words. What we're looking for in the coming few months is to do one reading per month. And pretty soon, this thing's going to take off.
Everybody's perceptions, and from what I've glanced at so far, it's been really positive and motivating us to do this again and again. So the main people that we really have to thank for this event is the support that has come from the Montana Committee for the Humanities, who provided a grant to us for this event, and the Montana Center for the Book. Additional funders were the University of Montana, Helena College of Technology, Lewis and Clark Library, the Myrna Loy Center for the Performing and Media Arts, of course, the Holter Museum of Art, Tumblewords Writer's Voice of the Billings Family YMCA, Carroll College's Languages and Literature Department, as well as Carroll College Honors Program, and Bedrock Books. So we have many supporters to thank, as well as many organizers, key people, like I say, who you know who they are at this point. I've said a lot of names. My name is Katie Knight. I'm the Curator of Education here at the Holter, and it's a real pleasure to work on this project and have so much to think about and now so much to read. So we have a lot coming up tonight. I won't go into any more length other than to say that all of those different organizations that I mentioned are the ones that collaborated on creating this project, and I think it really goes to show how what a rich culture we have here, and when we combine our forces, it's very powerful and moving. Rick Newby will be introducing our speaker for tonight, and I just want to remind everybody too, there are many books for sale in the shop here, so please, the presenters tonight all have some great books out there. You can buy them afterwards and get those books signed. Also, we'll be serving a really nice reception up in the High Gallery, so we encourage you to stay around and visit and dialogue and get the signatures and buy your books and eat the wonderful treats that Nikki Werdy has been preparing.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see you. It is our great luck to have Robert Bringhurst with us tonight. Never a respecter of boundaries, Robert, now living in British Columbia, is a man of many parts, a true polymath, well-traveled poet and scholar, translator and typographer, who yet has much to say about our place here in the Intermountain West. As a boy, Robert spent a brief, but he tells me crucial period of his youth in Montana, living in Missoula, Great Falls, Butte, and Billings before his family moved to Alberta. And I like to consider him an honorary Montana writer. He has, he writes, quote, felt myself at home in 1,000 named and nameless places in that long spine of mountains, steppe, and desert which I've walked in bits and pieces most of the way from the Yukon to Peru. A mere listing cannot give you the full range and depth of Robert's concerns, but it can tell you something of the passion, intelligence, and high craft he brings to every subject he engages. With Haida sculptor Bill Reed, Robert is co-author of The Raven Steals the Light, recently reissued with a preface by Claude Lévi-Strauss. The Black Canoe, Robert's study of Bill Reed's sculpture, is a classic of Native American art history. Design schools and publishers throughout North America and Europe rely on his book, The Elements of Typographic Style, which master type designer Herman Zapf has championed as the typographer's Bible. Robert is also a translator of the extraordinary trilogy, Masterworks of the Classical Haida Myth Tellers. His most recent books include The Book of Silences, poems responding to and evoking all those Asian poet monks he had read of. Ursa Major, a polyphonic mask for 6 speaking voices written in English, Latin, Greek, and Cree, and a new translation of the fragments of Parmenides. An ongoing Bringhurst project, which seems essential to our understanding of this place, is an encyclopedic work tentatively entitled The Classical Literatures of North America, a guide to works by Native American storytellers that survive in the original languages. It is as poet that we welcome Robert tonight. Guy Davenport has written, "In a time when the genus poetry has proliferated into a bewilderment of species abundant with pseudomorphs and sports, Robert Bringhurst keeps to the true and ancient lyric tones." And William Arrowsmith writes, in speaking of Robert's collection, The Beauty of the Weapons, "This is extraordinary work. It may be the work of genius, a work which cannot be used too carefully. Here something old and precious, almost lost, awakens into new life, our life." It is my great pleasure to welcome Robert Bringhurst.
Thank you very much. I've been listening to readings here all day and thinking not only that the readings are very nice, but that this festival ought to get the prize for the best introductions I've ever heard. And I'm not speaking just about mine, which was the nicest one I probably ever had. I just thought I would read you these 4 books, if you don't mind. Actually, what I hope to do is 4 different things, all of which are quite short. So I had to bring a lot of artillery. This may strike you as utterly bizarre, but I really do think of myself as a Montana writer because I moved to Montana when I was 2, and I moved away when I was 5. And Montana is where I became conscious. You know, my first memories of myself and the world come from this place. I didn't start to write here, I didn't start to publish here, but I started to know that I existed here. And that's a very important thing for a writer, just to be aware that the world is here and that you are in it. That's a good place to start. Well, I thought I would begin with some excerpts from an old poem called Conversations with a Toad, in which a man talks to a toad and the toad is silent in return. And they have a very cheerful little one-sided conversation about the end of the world. And so I'll just read some bits of this, if that's all right. Behind you, the owl, whose eyes have no corners. The owl with her quick neck, who faces whatever she sees. The raven with voices like a mussel shell, well water, wood. The dippers with voices like water on water. The ruffed grouse drumming in the Douglas fir, and the heron flying in whole notes. And the kingfisher crossing in dotted eighths and in quarters, both silent. Much later, 2 voices like washboards, one bass, coarser than gravel, one mezzo, crushed gravel and sand. Their beauty bites into the truth. One way to fail to be is to be merely pretty, but that beauty, it feeds on you, we feed on it. As you feed on this moth, toad, or may, he may yet be your dinner, his hazelnut tonsure, the face like a goat's, but clean, and the mane like brown corn silk. Nerves spring from his forehead like fern fronds, like feathers. He too is transformed. This is the last life, Toad. Those who eat will be eaten. That is the one resurrection. We who kill not to eat, but to mark our domain, to build and breed in place of what is, what we choose to create, have reduced by that much the population of heaven. Your ancestors, Toad, were kings in a world of trilobites, fish, bryozoans. Do you know any stories, Toad, of a species determined as mine is to cease to have meaning? Is it really so difficult, Toad, to live and to die at less distance from being? My people have named 1,000,000 species of insects. They tell me that millions more are unnamed, tens of millions among the living, and hundreds of millions among the dead. It is good news, Toad, that no one can list what exists in the world, but not good enough. Named or unnamed, if it lives, we can kill it. We owe to the stones that many chances and that many means to kill us. In the blank rock of Precambrian time, the earliest creatures, too soft to leave fossils, too light to leave footprints, have left us old proteins and sugars as signatures. We will leave chronicles filled with our griefs and achievements, a poetry spoken by locusts as they descend. In winter, the mountain goats think. In summer, they gather. Thought equals solitude. Toad, is there no other answer? Thought is the mind walking the ridges and edges of being, not the tuned instruments crooning their perfect routines. That smoothness is blasphemy. Thought is the mute breaking through in the voice, like ice going out in the spring, the voice giving way, the language dug up by the roots where thought has been speaking. Leap, Toad. Our invincible greed, a dead silence, an absolute absence of meaning, is closing. About 20 years ago, I started to study the Haida language, which is spoken on a group of islands at the top of the BC coast, at the bottom of the Alaska Panhandle. It's a language that has no known relatives in the world. There are other such languages. I mean, it's like the ginkgo tree or the ostrich or the human being. All species whose close relatives have disappeared. We are all what are called in biology monotypic genera. That is to say, each one of these genera belongs to its own family, its own group. So whereas the Indo-European language family or the Salish language family or the Athabascan family has lots of members, the Haida language family has one. In the fall of 1900, an anthropologist, linguist named John Swanton arrived in the Haida country with a bunch of blank notebooks and a bunch of pencils, and he spent 11 months taking dictation. He went back to Washington, D.C. with 5,000 pages of Haida oral literature in his notebooks, and he spent the next 2 years sitting on the 6th floor of a building a couple of blocks away from the White House, typing up the results. He imagined publishing all of this stuff, and a little bit of it was published. The rest of it went into an archive in Philadelphia, where it has been sitting happily ever since. I began working with these manuscripts, and I was just astounded at the quality of the work. I met poets, myth tellers, oral historians, singers, who ought to be as famous in North American literature as Walt Whitman or Margaret Atwood, and who were completely unknown to me and to everybody else that I talked to. So I decided I had to translate the works of the two best myth tellers that Swanton had met during this period. One of these two was an old man named Skye, who was about 72 or 73 years old in 1900. He spent the month of October 1900, 103 years ago today, dictating narratives to John Swanton. In that month, he told Swanton 3 stories. Of course, this process was quite slow because Swanton was writing things down, and Swanton was working with a younger bilingual native speaker of Haida who repeated in Haida everything that the old man said, and that gave Swanton a chance to write things down, and then they would go back, and on weekends, Swanton and the younger bilingual Haida would work over the text to make sure that Swanton had everything right. And then later on, of course, he started working on his English translations. Funny thing is that after he typed up the manuscript, he threw the notebooks away. So we don't have the literal translations that he made. So it was necessary to start basically all over again with nothing but a good typescript. If these things were told at a normal speed, the longest of the poems that Skye dictated would take about 8 hours to perform. And that makes it about a third, between a third and a half the length of the Odyssey, longer than the Beowulf. This is a big, complicated piece of work. So I'll just read you the first few minutes of this, if that's all right. In Haida, it begins like this. It takes a lot of lubrication to speak Haida. Ulgiragang onsu, ulcharagang onsu, skamskun ginwa lagan tulgitgan jilwagang onsu, ulhatga laga kogagang onsu, ulaglang stins, nang lukonas gan ising nang hitaganina. Why gan haul hatgaga lanagaguga chachtal tlchayang onsuga, tluga tlachguga. Why gan chachtalang onsuga, why gan gai tlgistlayang onsuga. There was one of good family, they say. She was a woman, they say. They wove the down of blue falcons into her dancing blanket, they say. Her father loved her, they say. She had 2 brothers, one who was grown, one who was younger than she. And then they came to dance at her father's town. they say, in 10 canoes. And then they danced, they say, and then they sat waiting, they tell me. And someone, her father's head servant, they say, went out and asked them, "Why are these canoes here?" "These canoes are here for the headman's daughter." The headman answered them, they tell me, "Better look for water elsewhere." And they left in tears, they say. They came to dance again on the following day in 10 canoes, they say, and again they were questioned, they say. "Why are these canoes here?" "These canoes are here for the headman's daughter." And then he refused them again, and they went away weeping. Then on the following day someone was there in a harbor seal canoe in a broad hat at early morning, they say. Surf birds lived in his hat, they say. And after they had looked at him in his harbor seal canoe, they asked him, they say, "Why is this canoe here?" He said nothing, they say. They refused him. They said to him, they say, "We cannot give you water." There was something white surrounding the crown of his hat, they tell me. It moved like breaking surf, they say. It was foaming and churning, they say. And when they refused him, the earth became different, they say. Seawater started to boil out of the ground. When they found themselves half underwater, the villagers feared that they might have to give him the woman. There were 10 more who attended her, they say, and they dressed one to resemble her, they say. They also painted her, they say. They painted red cirrus clouds on her face, they say, and gave her 2 sky blankets to wear, and sent her to the headman on the water. He turned her down, they say. He wanted the headman's daughter, they say. And yet again they painted one, they say. They painted her with seaward dark clouds, and gave her 2 marten skin capes to wear, and sent her out, they say. He refused her too, they say. He refused all 10 the same way. Then everyone in the village, including the children, hurried into her father's house, they say, and they wept. And they let her go down without painting her, they say. All 10 of her companions went along, they say. When she stood by the sea, the canoe came ashore by itself, they say, and the visitor placed his hat on the shore as a gift for her father, they say. Now, when she had stepped aboard, all 10 of her companions crowded in with her, they say. No one could see what moved the canoe. Once the women stepped aboard, they saw him out there, standing offshore in his boat, where they'd seen him before. And then they yanked the stitches out of the boards in the house front, they say. They peered through the holes to watch the canoe departing, they say. After watching them go seaward for a time, they could no longer see what direction they'd taken, they say. They did not see that the canoe had gone back down. And so they could not see where the one of good family was taken. That's the first 80 of about 5,000 lines. Maybe I'll read a tiny little bit out of the book that Rick mentioned, Ursa Major, which is a piece that was commissioned a couple of years ago by a dance group in Regina, Saskatchewan. I wrote it for 6 speakers who speak 4 different languages. At any one time, there are usually 2, 3, or 4 speakers speaking at once. And then there are some of these speakers are dancers, some of them just sort of stand around and have it easy. And then there are other dancers who just dance. But that was the choreographer's problem, of course, not mine. It's the story of the great bear. It's the story of Callisto, who was raped by Zeus and gave birth to a son, Arcturus, and was turned into a bear by Hera, Zeus's wife, and who appears in the sky as the constellation of the great bear. And her child, Arcturus, appears as the star Arcturus, the hunter, and, of course, as the little bear, Ursa Minor, the Little Dipper. So in this masque, this play, that story is told in the only surviving classical version, which is Ovid's version from the Metamorphoses. It's told by Ovid's daughter, speaking Latin, and translated instantaneously, just as at the United Nations, by the translator, translates the Latin into English. There's a character called the janitor who goes around muttering in ancient Greek from time to time, because the story only survives in fragments in Greek. There isn't any coherent Greek version, although it's perfectly clear that the Greeks all knew this story. No anthropologist showed up in Athens at the right time to take dictation. Together with this, there's a story told in Cree. It's a story that was dictated in 1925 on the Sweetgrass Reserve in Saskatchewan by an old man named Kakisika Pichtokeo, which means sort of it means the light coming into the house through the doorway. It's that amazing piece of light that shows up on the floor of the house when the sun comes up. So Kakisika Pichtokeo's son tells this story in Cree, and the translator, obliging character that she is, translates that into English too. So you don't have to know any Latin or Greek or Cree in order to hear everything that goes on, in order to hear all the stories. But these languages are all being spoken, so you can listen to them if you want to. Story about the relations between humans and bears, except that, of course, it's entirely different than the classical story, because the Cree hunters were not didn't have a grudge against bears like European hunters did, and that's why they haven't quite yet been exterminated from North America. Ki tahtawe pe aka isinu ita ke wawiket, e peakot, nama wikat wapame wa isinima. We apiko ekota ea. Once there was a man who lived alone, all alone, e peakot, all alone, never seeing any other people, no one there except for him. After sleeping through the night, he went hunting in the morning. Whenever he saw a buffalo, he killed them. He just took the tongue and just a haunch and headed back to where he lived and cooked his meal, and then, when he had eaten, gathered firewood. After that, darkness came the way it does. Living by himself there, he started feeling lonely. When dawn came again, he went hunting and killed another buffalo. Someone comes into his camp in the guise of a very attractive woman, and they shack up together and do other interesting things, and eventually they go to visit his new wife's family, and it's finally revealed to him at the end that he is married to a bear, and he's just fine with that. Thank you very much. There no vengeance taken. In the meantime, while that story is being told in Cree and translated into English, Arcturus, the son of Callisto, is doing what all adolescents do, that is, trying to tell his own story to himself in order to figure out who he is and why he is who he is. And so he does that. I'll just read you a bit of his speech here. Once upon a time, the sky was absolutely dark. Dark as the ground. There were no stars. Did you know that? Did you know that all those stars were people once? People loved and hated by the ones who never die. And on their way to turning into stars, they turned into animals and plants. Those stars are the plants and animals of the sky. They used to be people who lived on the ground. You know what else? The plants and animals of the ground used to be people who lived in the sky. And that's my mother, dancing on the yellow wall of heaven. You know, the people of the sky eat everything that you eat without eating, and feel everything that you feel without feeling. And the people of the ground think everything that they think without thinking. And my mother is a woman of both worlds, with no escape from feeling or from thinking. Last of the four things is that I thought I might read you a few recent poems. These are easy. There's just one voice at a time. The poems are all written in English, as I remember. And because that's the only language I write in, I just steal everything else. And they're all, none of them are 8 hours long, you'd be glad to know. Well, as this is an art gallery, you might not mind if I read a poem called Jotto's Bones. Did you notice a news article 2 or 3 years ago which reported that the bones of the painter Jotto had been discovered under the Duomo in Florence? Well, they were. Vasari says that Jotto was buried under the cathedral, that there was a marker. He describes more or less where it was. But the marker hasn't been there since anyone can remember. And some people were doing repair work on the stone floor of the cathedral, and they found some bones. No surprise, a lot of bones under European cathedrals, but these bones were twisted in certain ways that suggested that this might be Giotto's skeleton. Giotto was a hunchback, reportedly one of the ugliest men in Italy, although he made the most beautiful paintings in Italy. And so Vasari was consulted, and sure enough, these bones were in exactly the right place. So one further test was made to judge the authenticity of these bones. That is to say, they were tested for heavy metals, precisely the sort of contamination that a painter working in the early Renaissance would experience from working with lead-based paints and the other pigments that were in common use by fresco artists at that time. And sure enough, these distorted bones were full of heavy metals. So, problem solved. Jotto's bones. They were underneath the Duomo, just below the stone floor, precisely where Vasari said the marker used to be. And no one meant to set them free, and yet they lie here, naked in fluorescent light, for anyone to see. Heavy with mercury, lead, and selenium, the twisted, mismatched bones of the man who could make plaster dust and water, egg yolk, charcoal, and red ochre hunker down and sing the blues. Touching his brush, a vulture's quill tipped with a cluster of boiled weasel hair to his lips, lifting his hunched right shoulder a little bit higher, bringing his clenched left foot a little bit closer, making a taut and perfect gesture with a splotched, disfigured hand. A long time ago, I wrote a sequence of poems about the pre-Socratic philosophers, and I figured the last pre-Socratic philosopher was the playwright Sophocles. And I got to thinking that the last pre-Socratic philosopher was actually Cézanne, and so this is a little piece called "The Physics of Light," a sort of postscript to that earlier series. There's a physics experiment running in the back room. You should. That's what happens in art galleries these days. Shouldn't surprise you. We won't find out the results of the experiment if it's prematurely interrupted.
He just ran back to turn it off.
It's dangerous to interfere with physics experiments. As for nature, said Cézanne, that substance, nature for us humans, is more depth than it is surface. What exists from our perspective is always a little bit wider than it is tall, and a little bit deeper than it is wide, and full of sloping planes and sharpened corners. The colors charge each other up, light dances in between them. That is where the truth begins and hides. You may imagine getting past this just by changing your position, stepping to one side. And yet, no matter where you stand, the longest axis of what is leads straight away from where you are and comes straight toward you, nailing you in place. When you open your eyes, the sight of it pins you. Nature puts you everywhere you are. This is a piece called Finch. I keep a crooked wooden bowl half full of bird seed in the garden, where the siskins and the finches, crossbills, cowbirds, chickadees, and red-winged blackbirds meet. Each day among the finches there is one, a female house finch, Carpodacus mexicanus, I believe, who must have tangled with a predator or maybe with a truck. Not one among the others acts concerned. No one seems, in fact, to notice the black cavity that once was her right eye, the shattered stump that used to be her upper beak, and no one gawks and whispers at the awkward sidewise motion that enables her to eat, and no one mocks, crunching a sunflower seed, her preference for millet. Where ostracism, charity, or pity might have been, there is reality instead. I mean that their superlative indifference is a kind of moral beauty, as perfect as the day. If the red-tailed hawk comes by, or the neighbor's cat, they mention that to one another and are gone. They also say, hello. They say, I am. They say, we are. They say, let's Finch, and make more finches. But I never hear them talk of one another. They speak of what they are, not who they do or do not wish to be. That is a form of moral beauty, too, as perfect as the day, which is to say, they sing. By nothing more than being there and being what they are, they sing. They sing, and that is that. Thank you very much.